Okay, so I'm gonna talk about natural disasters and violent social conflict. Before getting to that subject, I wanted, nobody asked me my opinion on this, but I'm going to offer it anyway because I'm that kind of guy. I've been working on Plus Alliance issues for a while now, since its inception, primarily with Rhina. And I just wanted to make a pitch, even though you're an audience that is persuadable by definition, or you're here already, so there's a selection process that brings you here. But even with that, I want to encourage people to really make a serious commitment to pursuing collaboration around teaching and research through the Plus Alliance. The way I view it is this is an incredible framework that gives you permission to be innovative and go outside traditional disciplinary boundaries. As we all know, the incentive structure for academics is usually to be narrow and focus on your discipline, and you get rewarded as such. And so there's some reasons why people don't really do innovative practices and interdisciplinary research work, even though we say we do, but a lot of times it's just token or a name only. So this is a great opportunity. I think that narrow focus that people have in the academic world is to put it charitably, myopic. Less charitably, it's not responsible in terms of your obligations in a university setting. It's in some ways it's asinine. I guess I would go further and be more blunt, but we don't have First Amendment protections here. So it's my second joke on the previous speaker. So I'll stop with that one. But I just wanted to mention yesterday. So I was over in Canberra yesterday with Wes Hirsch, who's from the ASU Global Security Initiative, and I don't see where he is back there. And then there's Jeff Kubiak from the ASU Center on the Future of War, and Jeff is developing a new Master of Arts in Global Security, an online program. And so I thought we had a great day yesterday really talking about how we could work with the folks in Canberra. So I would just make a pitch that folks really do reach out over the next few days to people. I think there's a great deal of opportunity to do something that's meaningful for the future of higher ed, because I was talking with Wes and I were talking about this yesterday. Traditional model of higher ed is on its way out rapidly. I mean, we have to adapt to the new realities of the 21st century, and this kind of work is at the front edge, and not many universities, or at least in the U.S. experience, I can tell you not that many universities are thinking in this kind of progressive way. So it's a good opportunity. My own experience working with Rhina is a good illustration. ASU has a just a couple-year-old Master of Arts in Emergency Management, Homeland Security, and I direct that program. We have a concentration or a focus or a stream, if you will, here in biosecurity that's only possible because of our partnership. That's important because it draws in students to the intersection of public health and disaster and emergency management and public security issues. We wouldn't have that opportunity to offer to our students were it not for the Plus Alliance and through the collaboration with Rhina and her colleagues here at UNSW. So I think it's just a great thing, and just a couple days before coming here, I got back in the U.S. from a counterterrorism course in Israel. It's an ASU Study Abroad course, and obviously that's an interesting place to study counterterrorism. But students at King's or UNSW might have an interest in a course like that you might not offer. There's no constraint other than your interest as a faculty member in promoting that kind of instructional opportunity to your students. So I just wanted to make that pitch, even though I was not asked to. I'm a real advocate of this kind of work, so I think it's worth saying. Okay, so let's talk about the focus of this last Little talk before you go to lunch, which is an unenviable position, especially when half the room is probably jet lagged. But I'll try to go through as quickly as possible and get us on to a lunch break. But the motivating question for the talk is, are natural disasters a causal determinant of violent social conflict? So let's just think about the affirmative or negative positions in response to that question. A reason for being skeptical about the relationship between natural disasters and violent social conflicts, I would list several. This is not an exhaustive list, but just a few obvious reasons. First, natural disasters have a limited scale and duration, a limited geographic scale, limited time duration, and typically those do not give rise to social unrest. Particularly in any kind of stable environment, we don't really see civil unrest emerge, let alone violent social conflict, meaning civil war or international war. In part, I think, going on to the next point, people affected by disasters, from a problem definition standpoint, don't treat that as a governance failure in the sense that the precipitating event, the hazard, is not the responsibility of the government. People may or may not be pleased with the efficacy of the response and the recovery from the disaster incident, but that's not a catalyst for violent action against a government per se in most cases. Next point. In spite of what people might think, disaster myths are just that. They are disaster myths. There's a fairly robust, particularly sociological literature on how people behave in disaster settings. In spite of Hollywood movies, we do not descend into some Hobbesian state of anarchy when disaster strikes. So assumptions about antisocial behavior don't really happen in practice, just the inverse actually. People tend to be more altruistic and generous in crisis situations. Panic and flight doesn't occur in the way that people presume. There's lots of good solid evidence on that. The idea of people paralyzed by shock and fear when a disaster occurs, also not true. So why should we presume that in a disaster setting people would behave rise up in some violent response to a natural disaster incident? And then finally, we can say, well, we're probably skeptical of the relationship between disasters and violent conflict because there might only be a very, very narrow band of situations where the antecedent conditions are present that might permit disaster disruption to either precipitate or extend a violent conflict situation. On the other hand, in terms of the affirmative response, the reason that we might anticipate a relationship between disaster and violent social conflict, those kind of large-scale disruptions tend to weaken critical institutions. Given that creates an opportunity potentially for some party to exploit the situation for their own ends, which can include using violence against a government or a governance system. There's some research that would suggest that resource scarcity and relative deprivation alone is insufficient as an explanation in studies of violent social conflicts. So we might think, well, natural disasters might play a role in those situations. And then finally, perhaps the strongest argument that proponents of the relationship make is that disruption creates a strategic opportunity for those seeking to challenge or replace a governing regime through violence. The disaster creates that opportunity, and as such, parties might pursue that. So what does the evidence say? Well, Some of you may or may not read literature in this area, but there's relatively few large-end studies of this question. I just highlighted a couple on the screen here, a couple of papers, because there's not a substantial literature in this area. But the literature that is available suggests has some general commonality. A paper from International Studies Quarterly, the first paper cited there, finds that natural disasters increase the risk of conflict in low to medium income countries that have existing income inequality and political stability issues. A paper a few years later found not quite as strong a relationship in her study, but again, the study reference there found that antecedent political and economic conditions explain most of the variance in social conflict, but in a limited set of cases, disasters do have some effect. And there are a variety of country studies or country case studies and some more recent work that says disasters can prolong existing violent conflict. So in essence, what we see from the available research evidence is that looking back over a large number of cases over the last half century or so, as some of these studies have done, is that there's this in a fairly particular setting or set of cases, natural disasters can contribute to conflict situations, but in general, it's only the case where prior instability exists. So, having said all that, some of you probably know this very well. Some of you might not read a lot of disaster scholarship, but it's important to understand when we talk about hazards that precipitate disasters that we draw specific distinctions about the characteristics of a hazard itself. So some hazards really are acute disruption phenomenon, meaning they're temporally and spatially discrete. So if you think of a flood as something that occurs in a very specific place for a very limited duration, we think of that as a temporally and spatially discrete acute disruption. Now, generally speaking, emergency response systems, coping resources are fairly well developed in most settings other than, say, a failed state situation or a fragile state situation. In essence, responding to a flood or a hurricane or an earthquake, that operationally tends to be a tractable problem. Not that it's easy, but it's tractable. We develop systems. We know how wildfire behaves. We know how buildings tend to respond to seismic activity, et cetera, and we know how to manage that. It's not that it's an easy problem, but it's a tractable problem. You contrast that with other types of hazards that are not acute and discrete, but chronic disruptions that are spatially and temporally diffuse. Those are much more difficult for communities and operating systems to manage. In other words, response systems and coping mechanisms at a community scale or a national scale are less well developed. It's less of a tractable set of challenges. In fact, it's a situation where when there is not a simple, well-defined problem, we don't have easy resolution of the challenges associated with managing a hazard. So I mention that because we need to think about the issue of global climate change, of course, as you might have anticipated. Global climate change is a catalyst for natural hazard incidents and risk associated with natural hazards. And it's important to understand that global climate change represents a catalyst for civil unrest and violent social conflict. So thinking about climate change as a catalyst for hazards, we think in terms of issues like, or hazards like, drought, sea level rise, intensified severe weather, weather pattern disruption. These tend to be, or at least several of them tend to be chronic disruptions, and subnational, national, and international systems are ill-prepared to cope with the associated challenges of chronic, long-standing, temporally and spatially diffuse modifications of vulnerability profiles and disruptions to a range of social, economic, and administrative systems that are adversely affected by the presence of a chronic hazard and associated vulnerability. So if we take a look at how just about 2 years ago, I think it might have been July 2015, U.S. Department of Defense, which is not a bastion of liberal or political, progressive political ideology, hence has some standing and credibility on the issue in their assessment, I think. And it's just as an aside, in terms of climate skepticism, it's all probably everybody knows this, the Anglo countries, English-speaking countries, tend to be the highest, have the highest presence of climate skepticism. So it's no trivial thing that the U.S. Department of Defense made a clear declarative assessment 2 years ago about the presence and potential impact of climate change. So among other things, that assessment from the U.S. Department of Defense suggested that chronic hazard vulnerability associated with climate change leads to directly intra and interstate migration and other adverse effects on security. That should be obvious by this point in time, but it's useful that the Department of Defense pointed that out. From their perspective, and from not just the U.S. Defense Department, but defense agencies in other countries like the UK and Australia, extreme weather creates substantial demands on their assets in terms of disaster relief and humanitarian assistance internationally, and as well as providing support for domestic authorities in terms of response and recovery services during a disaster situation. Third key point: sea level rise is an issue of becomes an issue of maritime security as well. Sea level rise and extreme temperature adversely affects navigation safety. It's detrimental to port facilities, harms or creates adverse conditions for cooperative security locations. And then finally, the 2015 report from DoD also noted that has a discussion about how a decrease in Arctic ice creates a whole set of management and security operation challenges for the Department of Defense. Point being overall that there's a complex set of challenges related to security that the U.S. Department of Defense recognizes as a direct consequence of climate change. So if rather than, I said the fairly weak relationship in the existing empirical data on the relationship between natural disasters and security issues. If we sort of rather than thinking retrospectively look at more recent incidents and prospectively, we can look to the Arab Spring as an illustration of the complex relationship between natural hazards and social unrest and violent social conflict. So a nice set of readings on this subject if you haven't seen this before. Center on Climate and Security within the Center for American Progress put out a report document a few years ago titled The Arab Spring and Climate Change. Has a nice collection of readings that really details the nature, the linkages between changing climate and the social unrest in that region of the world. So if we think about some of the issues that have emerged just in the last few years, so the Syrian conflict, which is obviously a brutal situation, terrible loss of life. I'm not sure what I believe. I don't know what the total loss of life is, but I think there's been more than 7 million people dislocated at present. Somebody's nodding their head. I think that's the number, somewhere in that ballpark. The relationship to climate change and the conflict of Syria. Originally, and I believe it was in 06, but I might be wrong on the date. Severe drought there displaced about 1.5 million people, resulted in severe food scarcity, water scarcity, and those basic resource scarcity issues became a precursor for the civil unrest in that country, which then obviously led to the full-fledged civil war that we see in that country to terrible effect. Similarly, the Egyptian uprisings in 2010, 2011. I should have looked up who used this phrase, but I've seen people use the phrase hazard globalization. The Egyptian uprising is an interesting case about the complex linkages of climate change. And so in Egypt, a drought in China led to a global wheat supply shortage, which created food shortages in Egypt. And that matters. Why? Because Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer. Food scarcity, food shortages in Egypt was a major contributing factor to civil unrest there. So drought conditions in China lead to civil unrest in Egypt. We can look at the more recent immigration crisis in Europe, and as a consequence of the various conflicts in the Middle East. I would note that there are a variety of projected models that suggest that the Middle East and North Africa face massive food and water scarcity vulnerabilities. There's some modeling that suggests that region of the world is going to be largely uninhabitable this century. So we're talking about all the difficulties associated with by that scale, really small scale migration and displacement crisis. Think about when you increase that by a magnitude of whatever it is. I haven't looked up the numbers to see what that magnitude of increase it is, but it's large, and obviously is potentially a source of future conflict. So I'm got 5 minutes left, I guess. So I'll try to wrap up quickly. Climate change, in terms of it serving not only as a catalyst for increasing the magnitude effects of other natural hazards, we think of it as a catalyst or a trigger for civil unrest and violent social conflict. As I said just a moment ago, within this century, there's reasonable estimates that one region of the world is going to be largely uninhabitable, a significant region. There are a variety of studies about the challenges of food scarcity, water scarcity, directly linked to changing climate. We're already starting to see large-scale dislocated populations in certain island nations. In essence, we see the emergence of a climate change refugee diaspora. All of these things. And just as an aside, if you think about the challenges associated with absorbing refugees, that's not particularly easy. If you look at some of the Scandinavian countries, everybody thinks the Scandinavians are sort of, if your politics are liberal, that it's kind of a liberal utopia. How did the Scandinavians react when they started absorbing refugees? Not well. Maybe worse than the Australians would have, because that was a joke for my friend Dave up there. I was teasing him earlier, so that I know this is being recorded, but that was for Dave Heslop specifically. So maybe I should say I'm on Team Australia so I don't get in trouble later. But okay, so let's sort of tie this together. That's just a very quick, cursory overview of disasters and violent conflict. I think just to wrap this up, to think about this from what it means from a research standpoint. A lot of folks in this room presumably have security research interests. So one way to think about this is understanding the kind of security challenges and security systems operations that I mentioned from the perspective of the U.S. Department of Defense. We can study and pose questions and systematically assess those conditions that were identified and how they're likely to be realized in practice. But I think equally important from my perspective as somebody that studies public policy, I think there are a whole set of governance related research questions here, assessing how and why institutional frameworks, both international and domestic, and attendant policy development aimed at mitigating risk and managing crisis incidents precipitated by a changing climate, why that policy development may or may not be efficacious given the institutional frameworks in which policy development occurs is an important question. How and why innovation to manage risk associated with climate change is a fundamentally important question. The degree to which critical systems possess sufficient capability to manage dramatically changing vulnerability. I mean, we're talking about vulnerability change on a profoundly rapid scale. So all of those things, I think, that latter set of questions are really pertaining to basic governance around hazards. So I think I'll just wrap up right on time with a couple of closing remarks. While if you look at the historical evidence, there's some reason to be skeptical about natural disasters per se as a precipitant for violent conflict, and the retrospective historical analysis suggests that there's only a limited set of cases. Really, it's important to start thinking prospectively about climate change as a catalyst for increased hazard vulnerability, which in turn means we're really talking about not easily managed chronic hazard vulnerability, which then portends a future of climate-related conflict. So with that, I will stop and let people go eat lunch.